Hello everybody, it's me, V, White Zulu, and welcome to another reading from my autobiography of the same name. And if you hear any strange rumblings overhead, we're in the direct path to the bombing range at the Wash, to all the air bases around us. I'm in East Anglia, where it's all completely flat and has access to any wars in Europe. So they all use a certain area just beyond me as their practice bombing, and the jets go over very, very low and very loudly. So if you hear that, you'll know what it is. Mainly typhoons or F-18s or whatever. It's mainly Americans actually, but the air bases are British. Now this is a new chapter, 44. 15 years old and my first dance, 1965. Rocket's hooves made a crunching sound as he plodded over the newly burnt felt, which wore a fuzz of green now that we'd had our first spring rains. The afternoon heat hung over the baked earth, and my pony's neck stretched out low and relaxed as I rode, daydreaming with my bare feet dangling. I hadn't bothered to saddle him up, and I was riding him bareback. I was looking for some stray cattle on the far bank of the river, which runs alongside the edge of the indigenous forest. Our cattle wintered in the bush, where they were able to graze on grass which remained green throughout the dry season. And cattle are also browsers and enjoy the leaves in the thick indigenous bush to supplement their diet. I caught a glimpse of a cow with her calf in the deep shade of a yellowwood tree. She was a pitch-black Aberdeen Angus crossed with a Simmental, a Swiss breed, which has far more meat on it than the Angus cattle. And it was only the movement as she swung her horns at a troublesome fly, which gave her position away. I turned Rocket's head towards the shadows she was standing in and dug my heels into his flanks. As I rounded up the pair, along with two more cows grazing further back in the bush, and started urging the cattle back to the river, I looked around uneasily, the hairs prickling on the back of my neck. The previous afternoon, our Zulu herdsman had reported seeing leopard spoor in the soft earth on that same river bank, and our neighbour Mike had lost a couple of sheep to leopard just a week before. Even though baboons are their favourite prey and cattle too large for the big cat to take, I still felt uneasy as I jostled the reluctant cows back over the rocky riverbed and into their fenced paddock to wait for the count tomorrow. I hopped off my pony and slung the reins over my shoulder as I wrestled with the barbed wire gate. Rocket, normally a placid horse, suddenly started and, shying away from me, wrenched my shoulder and trampled on my bare foot with his sharp, unshod hoof. I held his bridle tightly as he circled me nervously, and I looked around, expecting to see the amber glowing eyes or hear the sawing, cough-like growl which would precede a leopard attack. Nothing. Just the zeep-zeep of cicadas, and the blowing snorts of my terrified pony. I wished now that I had the dogs with me, but they were a nuisance on cattle roundups, because now that most of the cows had calves, they charged any dogs running at my pony's heels. So I'd left them behind, tied up on the back veranda of the house, for our houseboy Mackay to let them loose again long after I'd gone. I quickly finished tying up the wire loop on the gate and, grabbing a handful of his mane, swung myself onto Rocket's shining, sweating back. I turned his head for home, and he exploded into a gallop, my head low on his neck as we bolted up and over the brow of the kopje and onto the dusty red track which led back home. We settled to a steady jog, and as we recrossed the river at the ford, startled a troop of baboons. Their lookout, a senior male, was gazing at his reflection in a pool, and the sound of rushing water had drowned out the noise of our approach. I was a few yards from him when he looked up and gave a bark of alarm. The rest of the troop burst away from the water where they'd been drinking and fled for the safety of the trees. The lookout male, rather sheepishly, I thought, made his way in the inimitable, nonchalant, tail-cocked, front paws crossed swagger which only a baboon can achieve. As we clattered up to the back gate, Evelina was hurrying from the kitchen. "Nkosazana, we've been looking for you. Shesha." Hurry. And she puffed her ample white pinafored bulk towards me. She yelled for Toto, one of our grooms, to take care of Rocket. I slid off his back, puzzled by her urgency. She bustled me along the kitchen veranda and down the long passage towards my bedroom. There, hanging on the wardrobe, was a dress, pink and satiny. It was freshly pressed, and next to it hung a froth of stiff net petticoats. Then I remembered I was going to my first party that night. I bathed in the big tub with ball and claw feet, pouring a generous handful of geranium-scented bath salts into the soft, slightly silted water. I inspected my foot closely. It still throbbed where Rocket had trodden on it, and the skin was bruised, but my toe was unbroken and the toenail still intact. I dried myself and scrambled into the dress. My older sister had worn it to a school dance the term before, and Mum had arranged for it to be laundered ready for me. I struggled into the stiffly starched net petticoats and slipped my bare feet into a pair of pink satin bridesmaid's shoes from Nicolette's wedding, which Evelina had put out for me. I hurriedly dragged a brush through my short dark hair and clip-clopped my unsteady way down the passage to the kitchen. Masango, our Zulu chef, was sitting on the kitchen steps, taking a break from cooking and smoking his pungent home-rolled cigarettes filled with a mixture of boxer tobacco and a generous amount of dacha. His white chef's hat's in its usual place on top of a pile of logs in the wood box. Evelina was working at the sink, shoulder to shoulder with Lefina, peeling vegetables together and chatting softly. Both women turned as I clattered, wobbling and, unused to those modestly high kitten heels, as they were called in those days, into the kitchen, dropped their knives and covered their mouths with their hands. "Oh, Nkosazana, ovo mohle. You look lovely," they explained. With appreciative whoops, they made me twirl again and again around the big kitchen. With clicks of approval, they fingered the net petticoats and stroked the satin dress. I tottered through the house to the front veranda where my parents were enjoying their whisky sundowner. Mum looked at me critically. "You really ought to have stockings on. You can't go like that." Dad looked over his newspaper. "I'm leaving in 2 minutes, so you'd better be ready." Slipping out of my shoes, I ran back to my sister's room, rummaged through her underwear drawer, and found a pair of nylon stockings and a school suspender belt. Dad was waiting in the bakkie as, shoes in my hand, I ran over the Kikuyu lawn, followed by 3 delighted dogs who, having heard the engine start, assumed they were going for a ride. I fended the excited dogs off with my foot as I scrambled into the cab, and we sped off down the drive, eventually leaving them panting in our dust. Dad drove the 20 miles to our nearest village in an uncomfortable silence, as was his way. As we left the dirt road and turned onto the tarmac, I looked at Nottingham Road. Such a pretentious name for a filling station, a railway station, and a cluster of stockyards. It was also Houston's store, a general dealership owned by a gentle Indian family, and a ramshackle tin shed with fly-specked chicken wire nailed over the windows, which served as our butchery. The party was at the stockyards. There's a big room behind the auctioneer's stall which serves as a hall. On sale days, the corrugated roofed building with its wooden floors was an exciting bustle of farmers who'd brought their cattle and sheep for auction. Their wives stood behind a trestle table, pouring tea from huge enamel teapots, and occasionally one would slip a buttered scone into my hand as we shy, overawed country children stood and gaped at all the activity, and especially at other white children whom we didn't know, as my parents wouldn't associate with theirs. Tonight there were blue and white crepe paper streamers festooned from the rafters, and balloons tied in bunches on the walls. French chalk covered the floor, and there was a radiogram on legs set up in a corner with a stack of LPs piled on a table next to it. Dad dropped me at the door and went to Notty's pub, the Nottingham Road Hotel bar, to while away the evening with other parents who'd brought their teenage children in from remote ranches in the surrounding farming district of the Dargle. Our hostess bustled me into the echoing hall, and I stopped at the edge of the dance floor in horror. I'd been pleased with my party outfit. In the mid-60s, from what I'd heard from my older sisters, everybody wore stiff petticoats under their dresses. As some half-dozen girls turned slowly to stare at me, I realized that fashion had moved on. They were all wearing neat little tight-fitting shifts and flat pumps. It was typical of Mum not to have noticed or realised either. Immersed in her life of gardening, she'd suddenly remembered that the party was due, grabbed a vaguely suitable dress from my older sister's wardrobe, and given it to the housemaids to press and freshen up for me. Slunk off to the girls' powder room and pulled the voluminous petticoats off, bundling them under an upholstered bench. Then I tugged the dress down and close around my skinny, tall frame, and walked back to the dance floor with as much dignity as I could muster. Early Beatles music was playing at full blast, and soon had dancers twisting and bopping on the wooden boards. After that, a slow dance number came up. A shy, dark-haired, handsome boy, the son of one of my father's polo-playing teammates, 2 years older than I was, whom I'd been eyeing from a distance, clumped awkwardly over to me. Wearing shoes was as unfamiliar to him as it was to me, and I'd already shed my high heels under a nearby chair. Most of the girls were now dancing in stockinged feet. He gruffly asked me to dance, and we made a clumsy attempt at a slow foxtrot. As he steered me across the dance floor, pumping my arm vigorously, he trod heavily on the same foot as Rocket had trampled earlier that afternoon. I was undismayed, feeling nothing but the strange bristle of his adolescent cheek as he held me close, and his heavy breathing as he concentrated fiercely on his footwork. I was in heaven. By the way, that particular toe still has a split down the middle of the nail to this very day as a reminder. My worst fear had been that I'd be left a tall, lonely wallflower sitting among the unfortunate few girls who sat primly on chairs against the wall, tapping their feet to the music, looking aloof and pretending they didn't care. After midnight, Dad came to fetch me, grumpy now, as we reached the dirt road again. It had started to rain, and he had to put chains on the tires of the bakkie. He lay on a sack on the muddy road, spreading the chain strips out for me to drive forward when he shouted the command, and swearing in his whiskey-befuddled state when the slippery chains wouldn't lock. I realized I'd also forgotten to tell him about the leopard, but this wasn't a good time. That's all for today. Hope you enjoyed it. And I hope it brings back memories of your own first ever formal dance or dance of any kind. And I want to thank John Moslane for setting aside his Friday afternoons to help me create these videos, my producer. And I want to thank Sean van Vuren for uploading my videos so faithfully and expertly. And if you want any more information, I've written several other books, all autobiographical, can't say it, autobiographical, and they're all on my website at www.whitezulubook.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll look forward to seeing you the next time. Goodbye.